I'm out in my garage because I'm getting to work on my newest commission. It's a kitchen island and a countertop made out of this reclaimed bowling alley material. And obviously, it's a really exciting project because this is great material to be working with. For one thing, well, it's bowling alley, so it's just fun. It's also made out of good wood species. It's made out of hard maple and southern yellow pine. And those are both good species to work with. They're durable and they cut pretty well. But there are a lot of problems with this. For one thing, the project is big. It's so big that I really can't get the piece of material down into my workshop. So I'm gonna have to do either some of it or all of it out in my garage where I have like 2 outlets and essentially no machinery. So that's a challenge. And then there's another big problem. It's absolutely filled with nails. So obviously the biggest problem with this material is just being able to cut it. I can't use any hand tools, and because my table saw is a saw stop, I can't use that either. As soon as it hits one of these nails, it'll trip the safety mechanism. So here's what I've come up with. I'm going to use my trusty Makita circular saw, and I've got an old, relatively beat up carbide blade in there, and I'm just going to power through the cut and see what happens. Well, that wasn't very much fun. And here you can get a good shot of the problem. Here are the nails, and they're going through the material this way. So when I cut through them, I'm not cutting them in half, I'm cutting them lengthwise. Oh wow, and the wood is really hot. The stubs of nail just about burned my hand. Well, that's one cut down. I only have 10 or 20 left to make. No problem. So here's the template actually laid out on the material. Now, this is the kitchen island, and the client wants the grain of the bowling alley material to run crossways, not lengthwise, along the island. And that's fine, but it means that what I have to do is cut off this entire piece here, split it in half down the middle, and then take the halves around to either end and glue them on like ears, so that I'll have a long enough piece. Now the problem with that is I need 40 3/4 inches of material to make the side pieces, to make the whole thing. How much material do I have at the end here? 41 inches exactly. So the margin for error is very, very slim. I've got to set this next cut up really carefully and make sure it's straight the first time because I can't do it a second time. Now, I've got to cut this whole piece off of the main section so I can split it in half and glue it on either side. But cutting it off is tricky too. It's much too heavy for me to hold it while I'm doing the cutting, and there's nobody else around to help. I tried a couple of sawhorses, but they're actually much too tall and they're pretty flimsy. This piece of material probably weighs 60 or 70 pounds, so I need a lot of holding force. Here's what I came up with. Taken these long ratchet straps that I bought over the weekend and I've looped them up over one of the ceiling beams in the garage. I've brought them down and connected them underneath the piece, and I have them sort of medium tight. I don't want them to be really tight because then this piece of material will rise up and pinch the blade, but I also don't want it to fall because this isn't waste. I need this. So I've got my straight edge set up. I've got my line that I'm going to be following, and now I'm going to make my second cut. So the cut went fine, and it's nicely suspended by these straps now. I've got a weird urge to jump on it and swing around, but I don't think the beam will hold, so I'm not going to do that. Okay, the fun never stops today. Under the surface of this bowling alley, there are several of these big T-shaped steel supports. and they're really beefy. I took this one off of the other end, and I've been taking them off as I go. I wasn't totally sure what they were doing here, but now I've sort of figured it out. Here's the cut that I made in the last scene, and you can see that it's nice and straight. And right here, here's the support. And I started taking it off of the other end, and you can see what happens as I took it off. Oops. So, I don't know if it was the glue they used, or even though they used about 1 million nails, maybe they should have used 2 million, but this stuff just, it folds up like an accordion as soon as it's not being supported by that steel. So I need to get some sawhorses under this side, let it back down again, and then very carefully take this piece off, because this stuff doesn't hold together at all. And it's not like there's any lack of glue on it. You can see all the glue on the support, and there's a lot of squeeze out underneath, so they used plenty of glue, but maybe it's broken down over time, or just the material is too heavy to be glued together this way. Anyway, it's another wrinkle. Stay tuned. Now, it might not be a good thing that the wood folded up the way it did when I was pulling off that side support, but I think there's one useful side effect. I don't think I have to cut this anymore. Let's see. Couple of nails. Gonna have to deal with those. So now I've got all of my pieces cut, and it's time to glue them up into the larger finished panels that I'm going to use for the countertop and the island. Of course, the big problem with this is that these were torn out of a bowling alley, and so the edges of the wood are pretty ragged. This is the joint that I want to glue up, and you can see as I go into a close-up here, this would make a terrible glue joint if I glued it up the way it was. It's much too sloppy to make a good joint. Now, this material is very big and it's full of nails, so no jointer, no table saw, and no hand plane. All the normal ways that I would joint something are out the window, so I've got to be a little bit more creative. Here's my solution to jointing the edges of these countertop pieces. I've made a circular saw edge guide. There are plans and videos about these all over the internet, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. Jay Bates has a really good video on this, so I'll link to that down in the description. It's basically just 2 pieces of wood with square factory edges here and here. And when you set the circular saw on it, it gets the base up off the workpiece and gives it a place to ride against here that's a known true straight edge. It works a lot better than just clamping a straight edge across the work, and it gives you much better cuts. It's kind of a poor man's track saw. Not as good, but much, much cheaper. And I've set it up so that it's just overhanging the work by a tiny little bit. When I go to make the cut, it's not even going to be a full saw kerf wide. I'm skimming off the smallest piece of the countertop that I possibly can, so I put the least amount of stress on the blade, get the least deflection, and get a really clean cut. The joint that I got with my edge guide and circular saw is pretty good. It feels flat to the touch, and it looks straight when I sight down along it. There's a few things that could be tuned up though. I do have some saw marks. There are places where I hit nails and that made the blade move a little bit. And there's a good low-tech solution for that. I've just got a piece of acrylic here. It's the thick stuff. It's nice and flat, and I've just glued some sandpaper to it, and I'm going to take this big long thing and just work it back and forth on my surface. It's probably not quite as good as what I would get with a table saw or a power jointer, but it's as good as I'm going to get. And with reclaimed material like this, some tiny imperfections are going to be okay. The client probably won't even notice. Now, throughout this whole project, I've been dealing with the problem that this material, if you're going across the grain, it's too flexible. It doesn't hold together at all. And now I have these huge, long pieces where the long axis is going across the grain. So they're just really, really fragile. I have to be super careful when I'm moving them, which is tough because they weigh like over 100 pounds. So before I do anything else, I gotta reinforce these pieces so they're not just gonna shatter on me the next time I let one fall 4 inches onto the tabletop. So I went to the steel yard and I bought several pieces of this 1-inch square hollow tube. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to dado across the whole length of this thing and set it in flush with this bottom surface. Now, obviously I would love to just screw it down to the bottom, but there's going to be undermount drawers on this thing, so nothing can stick out like that. So it has to be inset. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this piece of steel as my edge guide so I can go along and dado out the channel that I want with my circular saw. But there is kind of a problem with that. The underside here, it isn't level at all. So when I clamp this down, there's a lot of gaps between the steel and the underside of the bowling alley material. And the gaps are so big that the guard from the saw actually slides under them, and it's going to throw my cut off. So what I did is I modified my saw by drilling a couple holes in the guard under here, countersinking them, putting screws in, and then I've added this piece of oak across the guard parallel to it. And what that's going to let me do is extend that guard up so that it rides against the piece of steel, and I'm going to get a nice even cut even if I have a little bit of a gap. Now, I had to make the other side of my dado, but I didn't want to move my steel guide beam because keeping it parallel and moving it exactly 1 inch would be really tricky. So instead, I just screwed a 1-inch piece of wood to my fence, set that against the rail, and I was able to get the other side of the dado exactly parallel and exactly 1 inch over. Okay, now I got both my dados defined. I have the left and the right side, and now I just got to waste out the middle. And I think if I'm careful, I can just take the circular saw and just freehand some cuts through there, and then I'll follow it up with a chisel or something. I really haven't thought that far ahead yet. Now that I've got my dados cleaned out with a chisel, I cut the pieces of steel to length, and then off camera I drilled them and countersunk them, and now I'm just installing them underneath. With this steel screwed into the bottom, the piece is still pretty far from being done, but at least now I can move it 2 inches without having a complete heart attack that it's going to fall apart. So, progress. Okay, so the whole project is coming together. Here's the island, it's glued up, it's reinforced, it's cut to rough shape, and now the biggest problem that I have is this edge in the front here. You can see that my saw cuts came together in a way that was really ragged, and my surface isn't nearly as good as I want it to be. It's not going to be a show surface for somebody's kitchen. So what I want is a fair curve and a clean edge to the whole thing. And the really important thing is to have the edge be 90 degrees to the face so that it's going to have a crisp appearance, even though it's made from this recycled material. Here's what I came up with to solve this problem. I took my little Skill belt sander and I drilled a couple of holes through it, put bolts through it, and I bolted it down to this big piece of 2x10 that I had sitting around. And then I C-clamped the trigger, and I built some blocks here to level everything out. And what I have now is a sanding jig, a power sanding jig, that gives me a really nice 90-degree edge and this long arm that's gonna let me put it against the work like this and move it along the surface and keep a true 90-degree edge as I work down this edge here and get it smoothed out. So I'm just about at the end of working with this material. I've made all my pieces, I've glued things together, I've sanded the edge and gotten nice crisp 90 degrees, and now I'm just down to the finishing stage. The biggest problem is I have to get the old finish off. I'm not sure what it is. It's almost certainly some early form of polyurethane. Whatever it is, it's yellow, it's very tough, and it's laid on there really thickly. I didn't really bother with sanding because I knew that whatever coating was on there was made to be abrasion resistant because, you know, it's a bowling alley. The next thing I tried was a heat gun, and sure enough, when I heated up the finish and used a scraper on it, it came right up. But honestly, this was still pretty slow, and I have a lot of surface area to do. So I did a little experimenting, and I have to admit I was surprised, but you know what really took the finish off quick? Just a regular old hand plane. I was actually able to get this whole big piece stripped in about 10 minutes, and I know that with sanding or the heat gun method it would have taken me a half hour or an hour. So even though I got a little bit of tear out and some plane tracks here and there, this was still the best method to go with, especially since I have to sand the wood anyway before I finish it. The rest of the project was just scraping, sanding, and polyurethaning. And I didn't even shoot any of that because you've all seen it enough times before. I got it done in time to be delivered, and then it was the contractor's job to install it. I wasn't involved with that part at all, so I spent a couple of weeks just kind of sitting around wondering how it had come out. And then a couple days ago I got an email, and these pictures were attached to it. Now, I had only seen this stuff in my garage, which isn't very well lit. And seeing these pieces in good lighting with good photography, I'm kind of shocked that I made this stuff. I didn't think I was that good. It's a really great feeling to see your work and realize that it's actually better than you thought it was. Anyway, the whole point of this video is there's a lot of this reclaimed bowling alley material out there. Alleys are going out of business and sawmills are buying this stuff up, cutting it and selling it to woodworkers. If you come across any of this material and you want to make something out of it, I hope this video will help you avoid some of the problems that I ran into. Anyway, thanks for watching.